Hello, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. My name is Marina Dutra-Clarke, and I'm one of the genetic counselors at UCLA Health. I work in the clinical genetics division in the Department of Human Genetics, and I work primarily with rare diseases. And I'm so excited to see the CSNK2B Foundation expand and host its first symposium. It's such a great opportunity for parents and patients, clinicians and researchers to all learn from each other. So I wish I could be there. Having a hub like this foundation is really impactful. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about rare diseases, resources for patients with rare diseases that I find helpful, and provide an update on the CSNK2B gene presence in the genetic testing space. So when it comes to rare diseases, they are more common than we think. There are thousands of rare diseases, and most are genetic. So roughly 80% of the known conditions are genetic. And we classify a rare disease in the United States if there are less than 200,000 Americans affected with a condition. So certainly CSNK2B neurodevelopmental disorder would be considered ultra rare. But even still, together, these rare and ultra rare conditions all make up around 300 million people worldwide. So collectively speaking, they're not as rare as we think as a whole. And that's how I feel as a genetic counselor, because, I see a rare disease every single day. So I never think of them, as rare. And I say this just to remind you all that even though CSNK2B neurodevelopmental disorder is ultra rare, there is still that larger rare disease community to tap into, and which we often can forget since each genetic condition is so siloed. But ultimately, the early interventions and big advancements in technologies and treatments may end up benefiting more than one genetic condition, even at the same time. And you'll see a zebra often in talks about rare disease because they're a symbol to raise awareness for rare conditions. And it's because in medicine, the zebra was used as an analogy for rare condition because zebras are rare and less encountered. And so for patients with rare disease like this one, we definitely want to arrive at a definitive diagnosis or explanation for a patient's condition. And so we sometimes say it's ending the diagnostic odyssey or that diagnostic journey. And I'm sure maybe for most of you, the journey to get here was not linear. It was probably very windy with bumps along the way. But hopefully we can now provide an answer to why. And especially, as a genetic counselor, when it comes to providing a genetic diagnosis, we then now have an opportunity to address potential parental guilt or blame. This is a genetic condition, so it is not something that you did or did not do that caused this. Okay, it's not because you missed a prenatal vitamin or painting their nursery while pregnant. This is a genetic condition. And with this condition, similar to most neurodevelopmental disorders, it often takes a village. And so the team can include, your medical genetics providers, like a geneticist, genetic counselor. I think a developmental pediatrician is very helpful to be on your team. If available to you locally, there are not that many developmental pediatricians out there, but if you can find one local to you, I highly recommend tapping into them. And also a neurologist, especially for those with epilepsy who need ongoing care, as well as other specialists as needed. And I wanted to highlight medical social workers. They can be very helpful in making sure that you are taking advantage of the resources that are available to you. So those local resources, or also just care coordination as well. So if you haven't met with one already or spoken to one already, please touch base with your medical genetic service or neurology team because they may have a medical social worker in their department. And then also getting plugged into those early intervention services, so a full slate of therapies, and also having an educational strategies in place as well. And there are also many support groups, and they can be very specific, like the CSNK2B Facebook group or the foundation, or they can be more broad. There are many support groups for the broad rare disease community. And there are also advocacy organizations, which I'll talk to you about in the next slide. And then research involvement is quite common when you have a rare condition, especially an ultra rare condition. These are opportunities to participate in research studies, and there's an opportunity at the symposium as well. And why is it important is because, you know, each individual with CSNK2B neurodevelopmental disorder is unique, and we want to make sure that we have a diverse representation in our studies. That way we can better understand the symptomology of this condition, we can better understand all of the variants that people may have. And so it would not be uncommon to be part of a registry or natural history study when you have an ultra rare condition. So here I've just highlighted some helpful links to some advocacy organizations. The first one is NORD, the National Organization for Rare Disorders. They have very helpful patient assistance programs that I think are very helpful. Here's the phone number and website that you can look at. They can help cover financial costs of treatment and care. So for example, copay assistance or travel expenses for medical appointments. They also have caregiver respite programs, among others. So I think they're a really helpful resource. See if you qualify. And then they also have an information and resource services. So if you're struggling with, you know, finding a provider near you or services, reach out to them and see if they can help. They might have some referrals that they could recommend, or some names of clinicians or intervention services local to you. So here's their phone number and email address to reach out to them as well. And then I've also highlighted here an advocacy organization called Global Genes. They also have some grants funding as well for patients and families and caregivers. So you can check that out. But they're also really great at connecting people. So they're great at connecting patients to other patients, or clinicians to researchers, researchers to clinicians, researchers to patients, vice versa. So they'll be very helpful, I think, as an ally going forward for the CSNK2B Foundation. And then, of course, the foundation itself has a website coming soon. So hopefully we can get a lot of resources all into that one foundation website for both patients who are newly diagnosed and also those who would like updates on CSNK2B neurodevelopmental disorder. So I'm going to switch gears and talk about the CSNK2B presence in commercial genetic testing. Before we do that, let's do a refresher on different genetic test technologies. So there are many different types of genetic tests on the market. And so here are some of them. So we'll start with the most focused test we have here on the left, which would be a single mutation analysis, or someone undergoing testing for just one single variant in a gene. There are also some tests that offer a test of, let's say, the top 10 most common variants or mutations in a gene. So that would be a panel of common mutations. Or you can also have a full gene sequenced, so of one single gene. Whereas a panel is where it's a test designed where there are hundreds or thousands or even just tens of genes on a single test, and they're all associated with one single symptom or maybe a family of similar conditions. So an example of this would be a gene panel for epilepsy conditions. So let's say a genetic forms of epilepsy. And so a patient can undergo a test of hundreds or even 1,000 genes associated with genetic forms of epilepsy. And then here is exome sequencing. Exome sequencing is looking at, all 23,000 genes in an unbiased way. But each gene is like a set of instructions that codes for a protein. And so in whole exome sequencing technology, they're looking at just the regions that code for a protein. So just the coding regions. The difference between exome and whole genome sequencing would be that the whole genome sequencing will look at the coding regions as well as the non-coding regions. I'm seeing more and more patients undergo whole genome sequencing because it's becoming more clinically available. I'm seeing some coverage on certain insurance plans for whole genome sequencing. So I think some more people will be coming in with having had this testing done. And these tests down here are tests that are testing for chromosome disorders. So our genes are housed in our chromosomes. So a microarray test would be looking to see if any large segments of genes are deleted or duplicated, so missing or extra. And so that would look for what we call chromosomal microdeletions or chromosomal microduplications. Whereas a karyotype is also looking at the chromosomes, but actually under a microscope. So seeing if there are very large chromosome segments missing or extra, so deleted or duplicated, or if there are structural rearrangements in how the chromosomes are sitting. So I believe most of you who are diagnosed with CSNK2B neurodevelopmental disorder were diagnosed by exome sequencing technology. But there unfortunately are still many people out there who do not have access to tests like whole exome sequencing or genome sequencing. It could be that they don't have access to genetics providers who are more likely to order these broader tests. Or because of other barriers like cost or insurance coverage. And so for many people, there are still, unfortunately, that a gene panel is the last stop test, genetic test that patient will have. And so I wanted to see if the CSNK2B gene is on gene panels relevant to epilepsy conditions and neurodevelopmental disorders. So this is what I found here, that the labs that do include the CSNK2B gene on their gene panels are these 5 down here, these main commercial labs that offer genetic testing. And for example, this GeneDx lab had the most CSNK2B presence. They had this gene included on 4 of their gene panels. So they had it in their gene panel for epilepsy conditions. So on their epilepsy gene panel, they also had this gene included on their autism and intellectual disabilities gene panel. So that's a panel designed for all sorts of neurodevelopmental conditions, all in one test. I also saw CSNK2B on their panel for congenital hypotonia, so low muscle tone at birth. And then I also saw the CSNK2B gene on their panel that is for patients in the NICU who need a rapid turnaround time for testing. So a 7-day turnaround time. So it's a test that includes 3,500 genes that had been hand selected to be on this NICU rapid test. And the CSNK2B gene was on that test as well. So it was on 4 tests on their menu. And then here, the labs that do not have CSNK2B gene on their epilepsy or neurodevelopmental disorders panels were Invitae, Quest, LabCorp, and Fulgent. And I know it takes a long time for a lab to update the tests on their test menu. There's a lot of costs involved and, quality control and design. So usually they wait to batch genes. So if they want to update a test on their test menu, they tend to want to batch many genes at once. So you might not see an update, for several years. So unfortunately, I don't know if or when they plan on adding the CSNK2B gene to the next version of their epilepsy or neurodevelopmental disorders panel. But hopefully we can advocate for the inclusion of this gene so that we can help more and more patients get to their definitive diagnosis. And with that, I'd like to thank you again for the invitation to speak today, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the symposium.